They called him a living god. But behind the golden mask was a fragile boy, crippled by seizures and deformities, born from centuries of royal marriages between brother and sister. Court officials dared not whisper it, but all could see. The divine blood of Egypt was collapsing in on itself. Today, on Timeless Witnesses, we journey into the tragic reign of Tutankhamun, before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The ancient Egyptians believed their pharaohs were living gods, blessed with divine blood that separated them from the immortals. To preserve this sacred essence, they practiced what they called royal marriage, unions between siblings, half-siblings and close relatives that would concentrate the god blood in their offspring. For over 3,000 years, this practice created some of history's most powerful rulers. It also created some of history's most tragic genetic disasters. Tutankhamun's withered left foot drags behind him as he makes his way to the throne room. Modern DNA analysis would later reveal that his parents were full siblings, and that their son inherited a devastating cocktail of genetic defects: a cleft palate, a club foot, feminine hips, and a spine so curved that standing upright required enormous effort. But in 1323 BC, these afflictions were seen as divine tests, mysterious burdens that proved his godhood rather than evidence of biological catastrophe. The practice of royal incest wasn't born from perversion or ignorance. It emerged from a sophisticated theological system that viewed the pharaoh as the earthly incarnation of the god Horus. Just as the gods married their siblings, Osiris wed his sister Isis. Set married his sister Nephthys. So too must their divine descendants preserve the purity of their celestial bloodline. Marriage outside the royal family would dilute the god blood, weakening the pharaoh's connection to the divine realm and threatening the cosmic order that kept the Nile flooding and the sun rising. The earliest recorded royal sibling marriage dates to the 4th dynasty, around 2550 BC, when Pharaoh Judefthra married his sister, Hetephares II. But it was during the New Kingdom period from 1550 to 1070 BC that royal incest became not just acceptable but mandatory. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, including Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun, turned sibling marriage into a political necessity, a way to power within a single bloodline and prevent rival families from claiming the throne. The theological justification for these marriages was elaborate and deeply ingrained in Egyptian culture. The creation myth of Heliopolis told how the god Atum created the world through masturbation, producing the twin gods Shu and Tefnut, who then mated to create Jeb and Nut, their children. Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys paired off as siblings, establishing the divine precedent for royal incest. The pharaohs weren't just following tradition. They were reenacting the fundamental creation story of their civilization. This divine justification became so central to Egyptian kingship that refusing to marry within the royal family was considered an act of blasphemy. When Amenhotep II briefly considered marrying a Mitanni princess in 1400 BC, the high priests of Thebes threatened to declare him unfit to rule. The pharaoh's divine status depended entirely on the purity of his bloodline, and any contamination from foreign blood would sever his connection to the gods. The practical consequences of this theological system were immediate and devastating. Amenhotep III, who ruled from 1391 to 1353 BC, married his sister Sitamun and produced a son. Akhenaten, whose physical deformities were so severe that court artists had to develop an entirely new artistic style to depict him. The traditional Egyptian art form, with its idealized human figures and perfect proportions. Couldn't accommodate a pharaoh whose body was so visibly damaged by genetic disorders. Akhenaten's reign from 1353 to 1336 BC marked the beginning of the most genetically catastrophic period in Egyptian history. His radical religious reforms, abandoning the traditional pantheon in favor of a single sun god. Aten may have been influenced by the neurological effects of inbreeding. His artistic depictions show the characteristic signs of genetic disorders. An elongated skull, feminine features, a protruding belly, and abnormally long limbs that suggest various hormonal imbalances. The pharaoh's physical deformities became so pronounced that his own subjects began to question his divine status. Graffiti from the period, discovered in workers' villages near Amarna, shows crude drawings of the pharaoh with exaggerated physical defects. One inscription, found in a tomb at Saqqara, reads, "The god-king walks like a woman and speaks like a child." These were dangerous sentiments in a civilization where questioning the pharaoh's divinity was punishable by death. When Akhenaten chose his wife, he didn't look beyond his own family. Nefertiti, his beautiful queen, was almost certainly his half-sister or cousin. Despite her famous beauty, preserved in the iconic limestone bust discovered in 1912, contemporary medical analysis of her mummy suggests she too suffered from the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding. Her skull shows signs of cranial deformation, and her dental remains indicate severe malocclusion, a misalignment of teeth common in inbred populations. Together, Akhenaten and Nefertiti produced 6 daughters and at least 1 son, Tutankhamun, whose genetic inheritance would make him one of history's most physically compromised rulers. The boy who would become pharaoh at age 9 was born with a combination of disorders that should have been impossible to survive in the ancient world. His very existence was a testament to the sophisticated medical knowledge of Egyptian physicians, who somehow kept him alive despite his overwhelming genetic disadvantages. The court physicians of the 18th dynasty developed elaborate treatments for the genetic disorders that plagued each generation of pharaohs. Papyrus scrolls from the period describe complex surgical procedures, including attempts to correct cleft palates and club feet. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BC, contains detailed descriptions of neurological disorders that match the symptoms of several inbred pharaohs. These medical texts reveal that Egyptian physicians understood the connection between royal marriages and genetic disorders, even if they couldn't explain it in modern terms. One papyrus from the reign of Amenhotep III describes the curse of the god blood, noting that royal children often suffered from similar physical afflictions. The physicians developed a sophisticated classification system for these disorders, recognizing patterns that wouldn't be understood scientifically until the development of modern genetics. The mummy of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, tells a story of suffering that court artists carefully concealed. His skull shows signs of hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid accumulates in the brain, causing severe headaches and cognitive impairment. His chest cavity is partially collapsed, suggesting severe scoliosis that would have made breathing difficult and painful. His left foot is so deformed that over 100 walking sticks were buried with him in his tomb, ranging from simple wooden canes to elaborate golden staffs designed to support his weight. Chemical analysis of his mummy revealed that he had been embalmed with unusual haste, and that his body had been badly damaged, possibly burned before mummification. This suggests that his death was sudden and unexpected. Despite his chronic health problems, the embalmer's rush to preserve his body may have been motivated by fears that his genetic disorders would continue to manifest even after death. The young pharaoh's death at 18 remains mysterious, but modern forensic analysis has revealed disturbing details about his final days. CT scans of his skull show a blow to the back of his head that may have been fatal, His ribs are broken in a pattern consistent with a chariot accident or a fall from a great height. Chemical analysis of his organs reveals high levels of antimony, a poison that was commonly used in ancient Egypt for both medicinal and murderous purposes. The evidence suggests that Tutankhamun may have been murdered, perhaps by courtiers who grew tired of being ruled by a physically weak king. His genetic vulnerabilities made him an easy target for those who wanted him dead. The boy king, who had survived against all biological odds, finally succumbed to the political consequences of his genetic heritage. But Tutankhamun's tragic story was just the beginning. The real genetic catastrophe of ancient Egypt would unfold centuries later, when Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy I conquered Egypt in 305 BC and established a dynasty that would make the Pharaohs' sibling marriages look restrained by comparison. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt from 305 to 30 BC, elevated royal incest to an art form. Over the course of nearly 3 centuries, they produced 15 generations of rulers who married their sisters, brothers, daughters, and nieces with such consistency that their family tree looks more like a genetic spiral than a branching genealogy. The Ptolemies didn't just practice incest, they institutionalized it, creating a system of royal marriage that was more closed than any other dynasty in human history. Unlike the Pharaohs, who justified their marriages through Egyptian theology, the Ptolemies practiced incest for purely political reasons. As Macedonian Greeks ruling over a conquered Egyptian population, they needed to maintain their ethnic identity while claiming legitimacy as pharaohs. Marrying within their own family served both purposes. It preserved their Greek bloodline while adopting the Egyptian royal tradition of sibling marriage. Ptolemy V, the dynasty's founder, was one of Alexander's most trusted generals and a skilled politician who understood the delicate balance required to rule Egypt. He married Berenice I, a Macedonian noblewoman, and initially seemed to reject the Egyptian practice of royal incest. But as his reign progressed, he began to see the political advantages of closed marriages. His son Ptolemy II would fully embrace the practice, setting to define the dynasty for the next 3 centuries. Ptolemy II, who ruled from 2083 to 2046 BC, set the template for Ptolemaic incest when he divorced his first wife, Arsinoe, to marry his full sister, Arsinoe II. This wasn't a political marriage or a theological requirement. It was a conscious choice to concentrate Ptolemaic blood in his heirs. The marriage was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that combined Greek and Egyptian traditions, creating a new royal ritual that would be repeated for generations. The couple's marriage was remarkably successful from a political standpoint. Arsinoe II proved to be a skilled co-ruler who helped expand Ptolemaic power throughout the Mediterranean. She was deified after her death, and her cult became one of the most popular in the ancient world. The political success of this sibling marriage convinced subsequent Ptolemies that incest was not just acceptable but necessary for dynastic survival. The Ptolemies' commitment to sibling marriage was so absolute that they often married multiple siblings in succession. Ptolemy VIII, who ruled from 70 to 116 BC, married his sister Cleopatra II. Then after her death married her daughter Cleopatra III, his own niece. When Cleopatra III died, he married her daughter Cleopatra IV, making him simultaneously uncle, stepfather, and husband to the same woman. These serial marriages weren't unusual in Ptolemaic Egypt. They were the norm. The mathematical precision of Ptolemaic inbreeding is staggering. Geneticists have calculated that by the time of Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra who seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the royal family had been intermarrying for so long that she had only 6 distinct ancestors in her family tree going back 5 generations. In a normal family tree, she would have had 32 distinct ancestors over the same period. The Ptolemies had reduced their genetic diversity to less than 20% of what it should have been. This bottleneck was the result of careful planning by Ptolemaic rulers who viewed their bloodline as a precious resource that needed to be conserved. They developed elaborate marriage contracts that specified not just who could marry whom, but also how many children each couple should produce, and in what order. These contracts, preserved on papyrus scrolls discovered in the Fayum region, reveal a dynasty obsessed with genetic purity to the point of mathematical precision. The physical consequences of this genetic bottleneck were catastrophic. Ptolemaic rulers suffered from a constellation of disorders that grew worse with each generation. Contemporary accounts describe pharaohs with severe obesity, mental instability, and physical deformities that made them barely recognizable as human. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, described the Ptolemaic court as a menagerie of human monsters masquerading as gods. Ptolemy VIII was so grotesquely fat that his subjects nicknamed him Physicon, meaning potbelly. His weight, estimated at over 400 pounds, made it impossible for him to walk unassisted. He required a team of servants to help him move around his palace, and his throne had to be specially reinforced to support his bulk. Contemporary accounts describe him as sweating constantly, breathing heavily, and requiring frequent rest during even the simplest activities. The king's obesity was just one symptom of a broader metabolic disorder that affected multiple generations of Ptolemies. Modern geneticists have identified several genetic mutations that could explain the dynasty's tendency toward extreme weight gain. These same mutations also affected the Ptolemies' fertility, making it difficult for them to produce healthy heirs and contributing to the dynasty's eventual extinction. The psychological effects of inbreeding were equally devastating. Several Ptolemaic rulers showed signs of what modern psychiatrists would diagnose as severe personality disorders. Ptolemy IV, who ruled from 2021 to 2004 BC, was described by contemporary historians as paranoid and sadistic. He murdered his mother, his brother, and his uncle in a single purge, claiming they were plotting against him. He then married his sister Arsinoe III and forced her to participate in increasingly elaborate religious ceremonies that contemporary observers described as divine madness. The king's paranoia became so severe that he refused to eat food that hadn't been tested by multiple tasters. He slept in a different room every night and employed a network of spies to monitor his own family members. His behavior became so erratic that his own ministers began to question his sanity. One contemporary account describes him as a man possessed by demons of his own making. Ptolemy IV's mental instability may have been caused by temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can result from the genetic disorders common in inbred populations. The condition causes seizures that can manifest as religious visions, paranoid delusions, and violent outbursts. Several other Ptolemaic rulers showed similar symptoms, suggesting that this particular form of epilepsy was endemic in the royal bloodline. The court physicians of the Ptolemies became experts in managing the medical consequences of royal inbreeding. They developed elaborate treatments for the genetic disorders that plagued each generation, special diets for the morbidly obese pharaohs, mechanical devices to help the physically deformed rulers walk, and potions to calm the psychological disorders that made some rulers dangerous to themselves and others. These medical treatments were recorded in detail on papyrus scrolls that reveal the sophistication of Ptolemaic medicine. The physicians understood that royal genetic disorders were hereditary, even if they couldn't explain the mechanism of inheritance. They developed a system of medical surveillance that tracked the health of royal children from birth, identifying genetic problems early and developing treatments to manage them. One particularly detailed medical papyrus describes the treatment of Ptolemy Niam, who suffered from severe hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. The physicians developed a complex regimen of herbal treatments, dietary restrictions, and physical therapy designed to minimize the risk of bleeding. They also created specially designed clothing and furniture to protect the king from injuries that could prove fatal. But the physicians couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Each generation of Ptolemies was genetically weaker than the last. The dynasty's later rulers were increasingly dependent on their advisors, ministers, and foreign allies to maintain power. The royal bloodline that had once conquered Egypt was slowly destroying itself from within, creating a power vacuum that would ultimately be filled by Rome. The political consequences of Ptolemaic genetic decline were profound. As the pharaohs became physically and mentally weaker, real power shifted to court officials, military commanders, and foreign advisors. The traditional Egyptian system of divine kingship, which had maintained stability for over 3 millennia, began to collapse under the weight of genetic catastrophe. The most famous victim of Ptolemaic inbreeding was also its most successful survivor, Cleopatra VII, who became pharaoh in 51 BC, was the product of 11 generations of sibling marriage. Her parents were full siblings, her grandparents were full siblings, and her great-grandparents were full siblings. By any biological measure, she should have been a genetic disaster. Instead, she became one of history's most formidable rulers. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages, was educated in mathematics and philosophy, and commanded the loyalty of one of the ancient world's most powerful armies. She negotiated treaties with Rome, managed Egypt's complex economy, and maintained the loyalty of her subjects despite the political chaos that surrounded her reign. But even Cleopatra couldn't escape the genetic burden of her ancestry. Historical accounts describe her as having an enlarged head, protruding teeth, and a masculine voice, all characteristic signs of inbreeding. Her intelligence and charisma masked physical deformities that would have been obvious to anyone who met her in person. Contemporary Roman sources describe her as physically repulsive but intellectually captivating. The queen's famous beauty, celebrated in countless works of art and literature, was likely more propaganda than reality. The iconic image of Cleopatra as a stunning temptress was created by Roman poets and artists, who wanted to explain how she had seduced their greatest leaders. The historical Cleopatra was probably a physically unattractive woman whose political skills and intellectual abilities made her irresistible to powerful men. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were political alliances disguised as romantic affairs. Caesar needed Egyptian grain and gold to fund his military campaigns, while Cleopatra needed Roman protection to maintain her throne. Their affair produced a son, Caesarion, who inherited his mother's intelligence but also her genetic disadvantages. The boy grew up to be physically weak and mentally unstable, making him unsuitable to rule either Egypt or Rome. Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra was similarly pragmatic. The Roman general needed Egyptian resources to fund his war against Octavian, while Cleopatra needed Roman military support to maintain her power. Their alliance produced 3 children, all of whom showed signs of genetic disorders that would have made them unsuitable rulers. The end of the Ptolemaic dynasty came not from genetic collapse but from military defeat. In 31 BC, Octavian's forces defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. The battle was decided not by superior tactics or strategy, but by the defection of Cleopatra's fleet, whose commanders had grown tired of supporting a genetically compromised dynasty. Rather than face capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a trophy, Cleopatra chose suicide. She died on August 30th BC at the age of 39, ending a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Her death marked the end of the great experiment in royal incest, bringing to a close a genetic disaster that had spanned over a millennium. The aftermath of Cleopatra's death revealed the full extent of the Ptolemaic genetic catastrophe. Octavian's forces discovered that the royal treasury was nearly empty despite Egypt's vast wealth. The pharaohs' genetic disorders had made them incapable of effective governance, and their kingdom had slowly collapsed under the weight of mismanagement and neglect. The royal palaces were filled with evidence of the dynasty's decline. Rooms that had once hosted elaborate ceremonies were converted into medical facilities for treating royal genetic disorders. The famous Library of Alexandria, once the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, had been allowed to decay as successive pharaohs became too mentally unstable to appreciate its value. With Cleopatra's death, the last great experiment in royal incest came to an end. The Ptolemies had proven that a genetically closed royal family could maintain power for centuries, but only at an enormous biological cost. Each generation had paid a higher price for the privilege of pure blood. Until finally, the dynasty's greatest ruler chose death rather than witness the extinction of her line. The genetic consequences of royal incest weren't unique to Egypt. Throughout the ancient world, ruling families practiced various forms of cousin marriage, sibling marriage, and dynastic intermarriage. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which ruled from 550 to 330 BC, practiced sibling marriage among its royal family. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled much of the former Persian Empire after Alexander's death, also encouraged marriages between close relatives. But nowhere was the practice as systematic or as devastating as in Egypt. The pharaohs and Ptolemies created the most genetically closed royal bloodlines in human history, and their dynasties paid the ultimate price for this biological experiment. Their genetic disasters serve as a warning about the dangers of closed breeding systems and the importance of genetic diversity for human survival. The story of Egypt's inbred rulers has taken on new significance in the modern era, as geneticists have begun to understand the full extent of the damage caused by royal incest. DNA analysis of pharaonic mummies has revealed genetic disorders that were far more severe than anyone had previously imagined. These discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of ancient Egyptian history and the biological factors that shaped one of the world's greatest civilizations. The legacy of royal incest extended far beyond the deaths of individual pharaohs. The genetic catastrophe that destroyed Egypt's ruling dynasties created ripple effects that would reshape the ancient world and influence the course of human civilization for millennia to come. When Octavian finally entered Alexandria in 30 BC, his soldiers discovered a treasure trove of medical documents that revealed the true extent of the Ptolemaic genetic disaster. The royal physicians had kept meticulous records of every birth defect, every failed pregnancy, every premature death that had plagued the dynasty for 3 centuries. These papyrus scrolls, written in Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs, provided the first systematic documentation of the effects of sustained inbreeding on a human population. The Roman physician Galen, who visited Alexandria in 162 AD, studied these records extensively and incorporated their findings into his own medical writings. His treatises on hereditary diseases, based partly on Ptolemaic medical documents, would influence European medicine for over 1,000 years. The genetic disasters of ancient Egypt inadvertently contributed to the development of medical science. As physicians struggled to understand and treat the consequences of royal incest. But the most profound impact of Egyptian royal inbreeding was its effect on the institution of kingship itself. The collapse of the pharaonic system demonstrated that divine blood was not enough to sustain a dynasty. The Romans, who inherited control of Egypt, developed a very different approach to imperial succession. Rather than relying on bloodline inheritance, they created a system of adoption that allowed emperors to choose their successors based on rather than genetics. The Roman Emperor Augustus, who defeated Cleopatra, was acutely aware of the dangers of hereditary monarchy. He had witnessed firsthand how genetic disorders had weakened the Ptolemies and made them vulnerable to conquest. His solution was to establish the Julio-Claudian dynasty through a combination of blood relations and strategic adoptions that preserved political continuity while avoiding the genetic bottlenecks that had destroyed Egypt's pharaohs. However, even the Romans couldn't entirely escape the allure of royal incest. The Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, was rumored to have had incestuous relationships with his sisters. His erratic behavior, which included declaring himself a god and appointing his horse as consul, may have been influenced by the genetic disorders that ran in the Julio-Claudian bloodline. His assassination after just 4 years on the throne demonstrated that even Rome's sophisticated political system couldn't protect a genetically compromised ruler. The Emperor Claudius, Caligula's successor, commissioned a detailed study of the fallen Egyptian dynasties. This research, conducted by the historian Manetho the Younger, produced the first comprehensive analysis of how royal incest had contributed to the collapse of pharaonic power. The study's conclusions were so disturbing that Claudius ordered most copies to be destroyed, fearing they might encourage Republican sentiment by demonstrating the inherent weakness of hereditary monarchy. The few surviving fragments of Manetho's work provide chilling insights into the final generations of the 18th dynasty. He describes pharaohs who were so physically deformed that they could only appear in public wearing elaborate masks and ceremonial clothing designed to conceal their disabilities. One passage describes Tutankhamun's immediate predecessor, Smenkhkure, as a king who spoke in whispers and walked with the gait of a crippled child, whose very presence caused his subjects to avert their eyes in shame. The historian also documented the elaborate deceptions used to maintain the illusion of pharaonic divinity. Court artists were required to idealize the physical appearance of rulers, creating artistic depictions that bore no resemblance to reality. Statues and paintings showed pharaohs as perfect physical specimens, while the actual rulers struggled with severe disabilities that made basic functions like walking and speaking extremely difficult. These artistic deceptions became so elaborate that they influenced the development of Egyptian art for centuries. The distinctive style of royal portraiture, with its emphasis on idealized human forms and divine symbolism, was actually a sophisticated system of visual propaganda designed to conceal genetic disorders. The famous golden death mask of Tutankhamun, with its perfect features and serene expression, represents the pinnacle of this artistic tradition, a beautiful lie designed to hide a tragic reality. The religious implications of royal incest were equally profound. The collapse of the pharaonic system challenged fundamental Egyptian beliefs about the divine nature of kingship. If the pharaohs were truly gods, how could their bloodline be so weak? If royal incest was divinely ordained, why did it produce such devastating results? These questions sparked theological debates that would continue for centuries and ultimately contribute to the decline of traditional Egyptian religion. The priesthood of ancient Egypt found themselves in an impossible position. They had spent millennia teaching that pharaonic incest was not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining cosmic order. The genetic collapse of the royal bloodlines forced them to develop increasingly complex theological explanations for why the gods would allow their earthly representatives to suffer such afflictions. Some priests argued that the pharaohs' genetic disorders were divine tests, trials that proved their godhood by demonstrating their ability to transcend physical limitations. Others suggested that the afflictions were punishments for unknown sins, cosmic justice for transgressions that mortals could not comprehend. These theological gymnastics became increasingly desperate as the evidence of genetic catastrophe became impossible to ignore. The Egyptian creation myth itself came under scrutiny. If Osiris and Isis had established the divine precedent for sibling marriage, why were their pharaonic descendants suffering such terrible consequences? Some radical priests suggested that the gods had withdrawn their blessing from the royal bloodline, while others proposed that the traditional creation story had been misinterpreted by earlier generations of theologians. The crisis of faith triggered by royal incest contributed to the alternative religious movements in ancient Egypt. The cult of Serapis, introduced by the early Ptolemies, gained popularity partly because it offered a different model of divinity that didn't depend on bloodline inheritance. Similarly, the growing influence of Greek philosophy in Egyptian intellectual circles provided rational explanations for natural phenomena that had previously been attributed to divine intervention. The medical consequences of royal incest also had far-reaching effects on ancient Egyptian society. The elaborate medical treatments developed for genetically compromised pharaohs led to significant advances in surgical techniques, pharmacology, and anatomical knowledge. Egyptian physicians became the most skilled doctors in the ancient world, partly because they had to treat genetic disorders that were unknown in other civilizations. The medical papyri that documented treatments for royal genetic disorders provide invaluable insights into ancient medical practice. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describes surgical procedures for treating head injuries, may have been written partly to address the neurological problems that plagued inbred pharaohs. The Ebers Papyrus, which catalogs over 700 medical treatments, includes numerous remedies for genetic disorders that were endemic in the royal bloodline. These medical advances had unintended consequences for Egyptian society as a whole. Techniques developed to treat royal genetic disorders were eventually applied to the general population, leading to improvements in public health that helped Egypt maintain its position as the ancient world's most prosperous civilization. The irony is that the genetic disasters of the royal family indirectly benefited the very subjects who were forced to worship these physically compromised rulers as living gods. The economic impact of royal incest was equally significant. The enormous resources required to manage genetically compromised pharaohs diverted wealth from productive investments in infrastructure, agriculture, and trade. The Ptolemaic dynasty spent vast sums on medical treatments, specialized equipment, and court accommodations for rulers who were barely capable of governing. Financial records from the Ptolemaic period, preserved on papyrus scrolls discovered at Oxyrhynchus, reveal the staggering costs of maintaining an inbred royal family. Ptolemy VIII's medical expenses alone consumed nearly 10% of the kingdom's annual revenue. The dynasty spent enormous sums on specialized furniture, custom-made clothing, and mechanical devices designed to help physically disabled rulers perform their ceremonial duties. The economic drain became even more severe as the dynasty's genetic problems worsened. Later, Ptolemaic rulers required teams of servants to help them with basic activities like eating, walking, and speaking clearly during public ceremonies. The royal household expanded exponentially as each generation of pharaohs needed more assistance to maintain the illusion of divine competence. These financial pressures contributed to the political instability that eventually destroyed the Ptolemaic kingdom. Heavy taxation to fund royal medical expenses triggered numerous rebellions among Egyptian peasants and urban workers. The dynasty's inability to invest in military technology and infrastructure made Egypt increasingly vulnerable to foreign conquest. The psychological impact of royal incest extended far beyond the immediate royal family. Court officials who served genetically compromised pharaohs developed elaborate coping mechanisms to deal with the cognitive dissonance of worshipping obviously flawed rulers as living gods. Many courtiers suffered from what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and anxiety disorders. Contemporary accounts describe the surreal atmosphere that pervaded the royal courts of inbred dynasties. Courtiers were required to maintain the fiction of pharaonic divinity while witnessing daily evidence of royal genetic disorders. This created a culture of elaborate deception and willful blindness that infected every aspect of palace life. The memoirs of Demetrius the Cynic, a Greek philosopher who served at the Ptolemaic court in the 2nd century BC, provide rare insights into the psychological toll of serving an inbred dynasty. He describes the elaborate protocols designed to conceal royal disabilities, including scripted interactions that allowed mentally impaired pharaohs to appear competent during public audiences. Demetrius also documents the paranoia and fear that characterized palace life under genetically compromised rulers. Courtiers lived in constant terror of accidentally revealing the true extent of royal disabilities. Those who witnessed pharaonic seizures, incontinence, or other embarrassing symptoms were often killed to preserve the fiction of divine perfection. The impact of royal incest on ancient Egyptian art and architecture was profound and lasting. The need to conceal genetic disorders led to the development of highly stylized artistic conventions that influenced Egyptian culture for millennia. Sculptors and painters created an idealized visual language that bore no resemblance to the physical reality of their royal subjects. The famous colossal statues of pharaohs, with their perfect proportions and serene expressions, were actually sophisticated works of propaganda designed to counteract the evidence of genetic catastrophe. The more physically compromised a pharaoh was, the more idealized his artistic depictions became. This inverse relationship between physical reality and artistic representation created some of the most beautiful and psychologically complex art in human history. The architectural legacy of royal incest is equally fascinating. Many of the most famous monuments of ancient Egypt were designed to accommodate the physical limitations of genetically compromised pharaohs. The gentle ramps and wide corridors of many royal tombs were built to allow disabled rulers to access their final resting places. The elaborate mechanical devices discovered in pharaonic burial chambers may have been assistive technologies rather than religious artifacts. The Great Pyramid of Giza, long considered the ultimate expression of pharaonic power, may actually represent a desperate attempt to project strength in the of genetic weakness. The pyramid's massive scale and perfect proportions created an overwhelming visual statement of divine authority that compensated for the physical frailty of the pharaohs who commissioned it. The international reputation of ancient Egypt was also affected by royal incest. Foreign diplomats and traders who visited the pharaonic courts were often shocked by the obvious genetic disorders they witnessed among the royal family. These observations influenced how other civilizations viewed Egyptian claims of divine kingship and contributed to the gradual decline of Egyptian influence in international affairs. Diplomatic correspondence from the Amarna archives reveals the growing skepticism of foreign rulers toward Egyptian pharaohs. A letter from the Hittite king Supiluluma I to Akhenaten includes barely concealed mockery of the pharaoh's physical appearance, describing him as the god-king who speaks like a woman and walks like a child. Such diplomatic insults would have been unthinkable during earlier periods when Egyptian pharaohs commanded genuine respect from their international peers. The decline of Egyptian military power was directly linked to the genetic deterioration of the royal bloodline. Pharaohs who could barely walk were incapable of leading armies in battle, forcing them to rely increasingly on foreign mercenaries and allied troops. This military weakness made Egypt vulnerable to conquest and ultimately led to the loss of its independence. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which ended Ptolemaic rule, was as much a biological catastrophe as a military defeat. Cleopatra's forces included numerous Egyptian soldiers who had lost faith in their genetically compromised queen. The defection of her fleet reflected the broader collapse of loyalty that occurred when subjects could no longer believe in the divine nature of their rulers. The Roman conquest of Egypt marked the end of the world's experiment in royal incest, but it also preserved invaluable evidence of its consequences. Roman administrators who took control of Egyptian archives found thousands of documents that detailed the medical, economic, and political effects of sustained inbreeding. These records would influence Roman imperial policy for centuries and provide modern historians with unprecedented insights into the genetics of ancient royalty. The story of Egypt's inbred rulers serves as a powerful reminder of the biological foundation of human civilization. No matter how sophisticated a culture becomes, it cannot escape the fundamental laws of genetics. The Pharaohs and Ptolemies believed their royal blood made them superior to ordinary humans. But their commitment to genetic purity ultimately made them less than human. The weeping that echoed through the marble corridors of Thebes on the day Tutankhamun died wasn't just mourning for a fallen pharaoh. It was the sound of a genetic disaster finally coming to its tragic conclusion. The last whisper of a bloodline that had been slowly destroying itself for over 1,000 years. In their quest to become gods, the pharaohs had forgotten how to remain human. And in the end, that forgetting cost them everything. Their legacy lives on, not in the divine blood they sought to preserve, but in the cautionary tale they left behind. A warning about the price of genetic hubris that echoes across the millennia as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago in the shadow of the pyramids.